I'm just gonna start off the history review. I'm gonna make a video here just to cover all you need for history. So the first lesson, it's pretty easy. It's just a setup for the next few lessons. You get like basically Europe was taking over a lot of the world in this time, and they were doing imperialism. It's just colonialism. They're taking over countries who are less technologically advanced and taking over their culture. And many European countries set up colonies in many areas, and the British and French were um, very fierce rivals, and they had a lot of influence. And they did their colonialism because they had a really big need for resources. They needed resources to drive their military and their factories at home. So that was a very big motive for imperialism and colonialism. And there is a political and military motives, uh, just to secure trade and to make the to secure trade really and to make the public happy. Colonialism and imperialism, they did both of that. And now we go to the next page. There is different types of imperial rule. There was like the French way, which was the direct, and there was the British way, which was the indirect. France, direct was a lot more involved, as the name says, but it didn't literally let any regional people rule. All colonies were run by people in France, but indirect, it was run by local people who were entrusted to be able to rule. And they both had their benefits and drawbacks, which is like direct, they had the local people knew more about their lands, but the indirect, they had the locals knew a lot about their land, but the direct, it was more, of course, directed by the French, so they had more control over their colonies. And then it had a lot of effects. It's like political, economic, basically, just to summarize all the effects. It There's new cultures, new religions, new Christianity spread, and it affected the economy of these areas pretty badly. But it helped the imperialist powers. And improvements bring benefits and disadvantages. Basically, the imperial powers bring many new improvements to the areas where they colonize, like a factory, like they put in railroads and all of these things, and new medicine, which increased the population. But although this made people like work for less and all of that, I think that might be a question here. Let's see. Let's start off in the assessment. How did the Industrial Revolution lead to the new imperialism? The Industrial Revolution, it created a need for resources and a need, so they can fuel their factories. So they had to go to other countries to fuel their factories and get these resources to colonize. And then number two, how did Western nations come to dominate much of the world in the late 1800s? This is because in the Industrial Revolution, they also gained a lot of technological superiority. They got a lot of naval power, a lot of new ships, a lot of new guns, and this allowed them to dominate a lot of the world because of this technological advancement. So let's go on to lesson two. There was the Islamic conquest. Yeah, so this lesson is basically about a bunch of Islamic countries who were like falling around this era. So there was the Islamic conquest of West Africa, which was it's just about the Fulani people and Usman Don Fodio. It was a local preacher in the Hausa, I think. Yeah, they tried to like bring back the idea of Islam in Sokoto, which is in modern day Nigeria, and he eventually ruled the Sokoto Caliphate, which was quite big between 1780 and 1880, and he led many reform efforts. And there was also the Asante, which traded with both Muslims and Europeans, and they were also in Africa. But I don't think he will include that because it's quite minor. There's also Southern Africa with the Zulu, which had there's a bunch of Zulu people who migrated into South Africa, and they basically took over a area in Southern Africa. They're local people, by the way. By driving out, no, they're not local, but like they're African. They're African, and they were led under by Shaka, their leader, and they started many wars in Southern Africa. But eventually, they were driven out by the British in many wars. And there is also another group in Southern Africa. They're called the Boers, which are Dutch people, and they were Europeans, unlike the Zulus. So the UK, they were also trying to. So yeah, the UK, they drove them out of their lands, but then they migrated. But then when they found out that that the migrated lands that they were in had diamonds, the UK kicked them out entirely out of South Africa. And now let's go next. There was the European, yeah, this is the scramble for Africa. It was started when King Leopold the second of Belgium, he hired a person to arrange trade and discover places in the Congo. And this basically started a real scramble to get, because the Congo was full of resources at the time, they started a scramble to get a bunch of European colonies and to start that. And all of this was settled in the Berlin Conference, which was led by Prussia, which is known as Germany now. They were basically said to avoid bloodshed, they will distribute Africa diplomatically. And it was split up like this. This book does not have any color, but you can search it up online. Basically, the Belgians, they had the Congo, and then the French, they had a lot of West Africa. The British, they had Egypt, South Africa, and a lot of stuff. But you can look at a map. I don't think that's too important. Just know some of the general areas. Yeah, there was a big rush to settle on these lands because, yeah. And there was a horror. King Leopold did a bunch of bad stuff in the Congo, but I don't think that's going to be too included. This is the Boer War, which is I said earlier, which is basically the British kicked out the Boers from their lands. They were doing a bunch of guerrilla fighting, and they did a bunch of that stuff. And in 1910, the British united the Cape Colony and the Boer republics, and it had racial segregation. That ended in 1993. I don't think that's too important because that's outside of the era. And then there's Ethiopia remains independent. Yeah, they're a country that remain independent. Basically one of the only African countries that stayed independent throughout the ages, which is Ethiopia. This is because of their ruler, Menelik II, which is a great reformer. He brought banks, he brought roads, he brought guns and all of these things to Ethiopia, and he cooperated with Western powers. And another thing that was helping them was that they were Christian, normally Christian, not converted, which will help their case as well. So he was very cooperative with the Western powers, and he made the Western schools, and he also in an Italian invasion, he kicked them out. He resisted them and won through a bunch of tactics, which is very brilliant. Anyways, let's go to the assessment. Why do you think the Europeans did not invite Africans to the Berlin Conference? That's because the conference was for Europeans to split up Africa, and they did not care for the Africans' opinion because they were lesser in their eyes. They were not important. And then how did Africans resist European imperialism? They did it through guerrilla warfare, by doing mostly a lot of guerrilla warfare, a lot of that, but mostly it didn't work very well. But yeah, it was guerrilla warfare by staying in the forests and and some of the hills, and being stealthy, kind of like that. And they also they stayed independent from European powers by like sometimes cooperating and doing many political strategies. Anyways, my yeah, my phone battery is going low, but I think there will be enough time to do 6.3. By So 6.3, it's about a more Muslim decline in like Muslim areas declining. So there was Muslim reform efforts. There was like in the 1700s and 1800s, there's a bunch of reform movements in the Islamic world. Like as we said before, Usman Dal Fodio, he was trying to reform a lot of the Muslim world, but he struggled. He struggled in his area of Sokoto. And there was also Muhammad Ahmad, who declared himself as the Mahdi. You know who the Mahdi is. He declared himself as the Mahdi in Sudan, and he succeeded for a while, but his successor did not. Succeeded at resisting the British. And then there's also the Wahhabi movement led by Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. You know what it is, but to remind you, they wanted to basically bring back to the true ideas of Islam and to go against the Ottomans and all of these things. They, allied with an Arab prince. You know which one. Now let's go to the next page. That was the Armenian genocide. The Armenian genocide was basically Turkish nationalism. They became very nationalistic, and they started killing the Armenians in Armenia, which is in the, I believe, eastern part of Turkey. No, it's in the east of Turkey. No, and this was because the Armenians were Christians, and the Turkish thought that because they were Christians, they were gonna side with the Russians, and they're gonna rebel against the Turkish. So, in a pre-action, they committed a genocide and killed a lot of people. And a genocide, which is a deliberate and systemic killing of people who belong to a particular racial, ethnic, or cultural group. Basically, a killing of someone because they're a part of a group. Yeah. And then this is still persists till today. Yeah, there's also reform efforts. Yeah, Muhammad Ali Pasha, he is the reformer he's the founder of modern Egypt. He introduced a bunch of reforms. He was a Albanian soldier, but then he became the Pasha of Egypt. The Pasha just means like governor. And then he eventually broke off from the Ottomans' rule, and he reformed Egypt and made it into how it is today. He seized a lot of farms and that stuff. And now there's also the Suez Canal, which was basically after Muhammad Ali, the French built a canal. My phone just shut off, but let me just continue now. The French, they were building a canal, basically the Suez Canal. They built it, and Europe hailed it as a grand opening, and because it really reduced travel time between Europe and Asia and to India. But in 1875, the ruler of Egypt, he was unable to repay his loans, so to pay his debts, he sold a lot of his shares of his canal, and the British bought up a lot of these shares and started controlling part of the Suez Canal Company, and this eventually led to the British getting control of it. And this is one of the questions here. Who was Muhammad Ali and why was he a significant figure? Muhammad Ali Pasha was an Albanian soldier who would become the governor of Ottoman Egypt. He, in the beginning of his rule, he drove out French forces, and he brought out great reforms, and he is called the creator of modern Egypt. He eventually broke off of Ottoman rule, and he made a lot of reforms, and he was a very great leader. How did Britain gain control of the Suez Canal? Okay, So when the Egyptian government, they were in debt, so they had to, because of the loans that they had to take to do reforms. So they sold many parts of the Suez Canal Company. Yeah, they put it on the market, right? And the British bought them all up, and then this would lead to the British owning the Suez Canal over a lot of political intrigue, and so, a war, which is the Anglo-Egyptian War, where they claimed it entirely. Anyways, let's go to lesson 4 about India, which is basically the 1800s. British officials, missionaries convert. Yeah, there was British influence in India. Is that they banned sati, which was as like a widow would join her husband by death. So basically, that she'd kill herself when her husband died. And there was like missionaries converted a lot of Indians to Christianity. Yeah, and a lot of social change happened when the British took over. And the British, they used caste differences to their advantage. They used to determine how the native population could best serve British rule. And there was a lot of increasing discontent in India because the British East India Company, who basically owned India at the time, it was a company, they took a lot of steps that angered the Indian population, which is like a lot of they made Indians go into the military, and they did the first insult, which was when basically troops had to bite the tips of the cartridges, which were oiled with pig and beef lard, which was haram to the Hindus and the Muslims in the army. So this caused a lot of discontent and especially and eventually a rebellion where a bunch of angry sepoys rose up against the British officers, and it caused a lot of bloodshed. But eventually it was a British victory. But this did lead to uh, the British, the British East India Company being taken over by the British state itself. The other consequence was that the rebellion left a lot of bad legacy between the British and Indians, and it basically made them not trust each other. And as well, there was a bit of an unequal partnership, as Britain saw India as like it's a market of raw materials, and like the British, they built a lot of things, but the Indians, they did not think that this was too fair, and like it basically crashed the Indian textile industry with a lot of the imported textiles from textiles, and they made a lot of the British made a lot of new industries, but they also did a lot of deforestation, and they made the Indians grow cash crops, and this led to a lot of strains on population growth and famine. And here the assessment is not included. So going to 6.5, there is China. The Westerners had a lot of interest in China, where China was because the Westerners were importing more from China than they exported to China, so they had a trade deficit, and the Chinese had a trade surplus, which was exporting more than it imported. So, of course, the China, I mean, excuse me, this led to a lot of uh, changes in relations. And in the Industrial Revolution, this during the Industrial Revolution, this gave a lot the Europeans a lot more power. So they bargained for more trading rights, and then this triggered the Opium War, which was the late 1700s. But the British, they discovered that they could get a lot of profit by selling opium, which is a drug that they grew in India, to the Chinese. But of course, the Chinese government did not like this and outlawed opium. This started, like they executed a lot of people who were selling opium, and this started the Opium War, in which the UK declared war on China and won. And they won a lot of trading rights, and they opened a lot more cities. And then there was the Taiping Rebellion, in which basically the Qing Dynasty. The Qing Dynasty was the Chinese dynasty in charge of China at the time. There was a lot of problems there, like a famine, floods, population explosion, corruption. This led to the Taiping Rebellion. It is when this person called Hong Zhiquan, you should know his name, he was basically declared himself as the brother of Jesus Christ, and he started a rebellion with many of his fellow Chinese people because they were angry at the government, and he established a Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, and he had a lot of success at the time. He wanted a lot of because he wanted reform and he wanted to push out the Westerners, and he had a lot of success. He took over many cities, and the movement spread. But the government it took a heavy toll on them trying to get rid of the rebellion. But with the help of the Westerners, the Qing Dynasty crushed the rebellion, and it led to more than 20 million Chinese dying, which is the largest amount in history. And during the rebellion, Europeans seized a lot more lands. Like Russia seized Vladivostok in northern China. And then there's also the Sino-Japanese War, which is when basically the island of Japan, they were rapidly industrializing at this time because when they first made contact with the Europeans, basically, they started industrializing. When America, they opened up the country, they started industrializing, so they could stop the unequal treaties, and they did. They industrialized very fast, and they got a lot more technology. And this made them want to get more resources. So, of course, this led them to declare war on China, where they got Taiwan and Korea and these areas. And then now we go to the Boxer Uprising, which is when basically a lot of Chinese peasants, they formed a secret society. It's called the Righteous Harmonious Fists. And they were called the Boxers because Westerners saw them train in martial arts. They dubbed them the Boxers. And their goals were to drive out the foreigners and to restore the Chinese ways. And throughout the early 1900s, throughout late 1899 and 1900s, the Boxers killed foreigners. And in response, a bunch of the Westerners and the Japanese as well, they organized a multinational force to take out this Boxer rebellion. And at first, the Empress Cixi, she supported it, but after they started losing, they reversed the policy. And the Europeans, they also besieged Beijing. The song was made on that later, but that's not related. Anyways, there was after the uprising failed, the Chinese people, the Chinese government and people knew that they needed to do reform, and the Chinese nationalism spread. And there was reforms who want to strengthen the government. And then there was a passionate spokesman for the Chinese Republic. He was called Sun Yizhan, but most people call him Sun Yat-sen, and I think most people around the world call him Sun Yat-sen. So yeah, in the early 1900s, he organized an alliance to rebuild China on the three principles of the people. Basically, he was democratic, he wanted a republic, and he wanted economic security, and he wanted to drive out the foreigners. Yeah. And then a republic is born. So when Cixi died in 1908, a 2-year-old boy inherited the throne, and this drove China into chaos. And then in 1911, and there was a lot of uprisings, warlords, and a lot of people who toppled the Qing dynasty, and this ended China's 2,000-year-old monarchy. Very important, ending China's 2,000-year-old monarchy. That's probably going to be the test because that's you mentioned a lot in like when people talk about this. So Sun Yat-sen, he hurried home from the United States and he was sworn in as president of the Chinese Republic. The Republic faced a lot of problems, but it was constantly towards itself. Okay, so the assessment. Summarize the sequence of events, of conflicts, and their consequences that weakened King China. There was many conflicts. The first, there was the Opium War and wars, but the Opium Wars, basically, it is when the UK fought for trading rights, and which was started by them trying to trade opium into the country. And the effects of this war, or it basically weakened China a lot because it started the unequal treaties that China had to go to, had to do, and it made them open up trading rights, and it also made them let opium in the country. So, which like basically drugged their people and made them retarded. And there's also many rebellions, like the Taiping Rebellion, which cost them a lot because, of course, they had to divert a lot of manpower. And also, a lot of the generals who crushed the rebellion, they inherited land there, which land and where like they crushed the rebellion. So this also delegitimized the Chinese government, and it made it weaker. And there was also the Boxer Rebellion, where a bunch of Western powers had to crush the rebellion for the Qing dynasty, which also happened in the Taiping Rebellion, but here it happened on a larger scale, which also weakened the Chinese government as well. Yeah, what internal problems threatened the Qing dynasty? There was many rebellions, like the Taiping Rebellion and the Boxer Rebellion, and there was also the sale of opium in the country, which spurred many problems in the country, as well as the problems made by like the foreigners encroaching, but that's not really internal. And what were the goals of Chinese reformers? It is to beat back the foreigners and to really reform the country and to modernize it, to be able to do this. And then describe how a republic replaced the Qing dynasty. It was basically when in Cixi, when the Empress Cixi died, this led to a lot of chaos, and this led to the republic to getting into charge, because when Sun Yat-sen, he took over, Sun Yat-sen, and he basically led the Republicans, and he took over and he crushed the warlords, and he formed a republic for a little bit. And there's also this cartoon here, which is going to be important. It could be in the test. So here the dogs, you can see this dog is the United States, this one is the UK, and this one is maybe France or something like that. Yeah, the United States, yeah, Japan and Britain actually. The United States, and then there's Japan and Britain. And the garden opened door to Chinese trade. Which country opened the door? It was the UK. So basically, it's just saying that these countries, which is America, Japanese, and the UK, were basically controlling Chinese trade, and they controlled a lot of things in China. That's basically the main idea of this political comic. 6.6 is the Tokugawa, is the Japanese. So there was the Tokugawa shogunate. It was basically they were in charge of Japan at the time, and they were ended a long period of lawlessness and chaos in Japan, which like lasted a long time for 100 years, and the emperor he still lived in Kyoto, which was before it was the emperor ruling, but they basically governed out of Edo, which will be important later, and it was run by shoguns. They imposed central feudalism, and they basically closed off the country. And daimyo means the people, by the way, right here. But yeah, the Tokugawas, they closed Japan to all foreigners, basically, and barred the Japanese from traveling overseas. But the only people who could trade with them was the Dutch through Nagasaki. But for almost 250 years, they were isolated, and the economy expanded, culture expanded, farms expanded in that time. But they were basically disturbed by the Americans coming in and opening up, forcing them to open up their country. So this led to the Meiji Restoration, which is when the young emperor known as Meiji began a long reign, and he started modernizing the country. The Meiji Restoration lasted from 1868 to 1912. It's a major turning point in Japanese history, and the Meiji reforms, they ruled in the emperor's names, but they were basically just devices to control the government. And they started modernizing Japan and strengthening it against the West. Their motto was a rich country and a strong military. And they set out to study Western ways and adapt them to Japanese needs. And they eventually had to give in to Western demands, but they traveled abroad to learn about the Western governments. And eventually, they adopted a German style legislature and constitution. So they got a Western system and Western technology, and they started doing Western technology. And there was rapid industrialization, and they encouraged Japanese business to adopt Western methods. They set up modern banking and telegraphs, and to get the industry started, they built factories and sold them to wealthy businesses, business families who developed them further. This led to like big business dynasties like Mitsubishi and Kawasaki. They're very important till today. You know, Mitsubishi, they make the cars, and right now, and they ruled over many industrial empires. They were like the Rockefellers in America, and they were known as Zanbatsu, which could be important. And then, yeah, by the 1890s, the industry was booming. There was, industry was booming, and there was a lot of industry and stuff. It was an amazing success. Japan, they modernized with great speed, and it was a success because it was a homogeneous society, because the people followed a common culture and language. They could set out to do something as a society. And there was a lot of economic growth during Tokugawa times. So this led them to a road to development. And they adapted a lot of ideas from foreign powers. So this allowed them to resist Western powers and to get rid of a lot of the unequal treaties. And then Japan expands. Basically, they started going to China, declaring war on China, getting Japan, and like getting many areas and getting Taiwan. And this showed them that they were a lot more serious. But most importantly, in the Russo-Japanese War, they basically defeated Russian troops in Manchuria, which the importance of this is because it was the first time an Asian country defeated a Western power, a modernized Western power, in a very long time, and actually the first time. So this made Japan as a serious country for the Western powers, and they made them really a threat. So let's go to the assessment now. What was the main reason Japan became an imperialist power? It is because they had to fuel their resource demands, and that their industrial revolution caused. Okay, so let's look at this cartoon that we have to analyze. So yeah, Japan begins an imperialist agenda in Korea based on who else had imperialist ambition in Korea. Okay, so this is like the Japanese, they are crushing Korea. This is the Japanese, and they're crushing Korea, and we can see that the Russians in the background are looking at this. They're observing this, and they also have wants in Korea. So this basically means that emphasizes the like Japanese imperialism, and the Russians are watching this because they also want to do things in this region. Anyways, going to the next lesson. There is European imperialism in Southeast Asia. This is basically Southeast Asia. It commands the sea lanes between India and China, and it had been long influenced by like a lot of civilizations. Yeah, okay. So European merchants they got footholds here, but most of the time local peoples remained independent. But when the Industrial Revolution happened, Western powers came here and started colonizing. Like in the Dutch East Indies, they colonized a lot of Indonesia, and there was the British in Burma, French in Indochina, and Siam stayed independent. Oh wait, did I not highlight this? Oh no, I did. It's just he skipped these pages. Okay. There was also, let's skip ahead. This is Australia's indigenous peoples, which is the indigenous people in Australia. They were called the Aborigines or Aboriginals, and they called themselves the Kooris, and they were reached Australia about 40,000 years ago from Southeast Asia, and they were indigenous. They're the original inhabitants of Australia, and they were isolated for a long time. And, yeah. And then there was the arrival of the Maori in New Zealand, which is the ancestors of the Maori had reached New Zealand from Polynesia in the year 1200, and they were skilled navigators. And in New Zealand, the Maori they lived in small hunting bands, and they raised sweet potatoes and yams. And then there was the arrival of Europeans. James Cook, he arrived in Australia, and he started colonizing it as well as in New Zealand, and started to spread Christianity. Anyways, there's the Maori struggles. In 1840, the Britain they annexed New Zealand just to keep the French from claiming it. And unlike Australia they were the indigenous people were spread out because Australia is such a big continent. The people, the Maori in New Zealand, they are very concentrated, which is 100,000 Maoris lived in New Zealand. But after the Europeans came in, there was about only 45,000 because the colonists, they very violent, killed a lot of natives, even though they try to buy up their land. There's no assessment for this lesson, so we're going to the last lesson. So this one is about Latin America and the Mexicans and this stuff. Yeah, this is political problems linger. So this was after the Spanish took away after the Spanish stopped colonizing Spain and they let them be. The Spanish stopped colonizing Latin America and let them be independent. So this basically Simon Bolivar, he hoped to create a single Latin American nation because they all shared the same language, but this didn't happen because of a lot of feuds among leaders, geographic barriers, local nationalism and stuff, and there was 20 separate nations emerged in the end. And they all wrote constitutions based off of the United States mostly, and they set up republics. They were really plagued by a lot of revolts and civil wars and dictatorships. Now we have the rise of dictators. Because a lot of these countries didn't really have a tradition of unity within them because they're newly colonized, they didn't have a lot of history before that. So they were really very weakened by regionalism or like loyalty to a local area, and a lot of local strongmen, they're called caudillos. You should know that vocab. They assembled private armies to resist the central government, and sometimes these caudillos would take control of the government and they gained national power. They ignore constitution and rule as dictators. And this led to a lot of revolts and things like this. There was also conservatives and liberals. Like in Europe, there was the ruling class in Latin America. They were divided between conservatives and liberals. There was the conservatives who they defended the traditional order and they favored censorship and they really liked the Catholic Church. And they want to maintain the social order. And then the liberals they backed liberty, equality, popular sovereignty, laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire means like they don't involve themselves in the economy and let it be with itself, and religious toleration. Liberal ideas. And they also liked freedom of the press. And they also wanted to weaken the power of the Catholic Church, bringing up its vast land holdings, and they want to break up their monopoly. And then we have Santa Anna and the war with the United States, which is basically when the Mexicans, when there was this Karen Cadillo, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. He was basically the leader of Mexico at the time, and he allied with Spain during Mexico's War of Independence. He switched a lot of sides. But anyways, there was a lot of settlers who went to Mexico's northern properties, northern territories like Mexico, California at the time, and New Mexico. These areas, and they took advantage of a lot of the chaos in Mexico to because in this area Mexico didn't really have a lot of power because they were busy with their own things in Mexico with the Cadillos and the revolts and all of that stuff. So a lot of these settlers they sought independence. So yeah, they had moved to Texas and the United States from the United States and wanted to ensure a stable government. Yeah, so basically the people in Texas they declared themselves independent and aligned themselves to the United States. The Texas forces the Mexican forces they crushed them at the Alamo, Alamo is important, but the Mexicans were soon defeated in 1836 because of the Americans, and they were soon forced to recognize Texas as a country. And he returned to Mexico in disgrace, but he reemerged as a hero because of a brief conflict with France. But after the United States annexed Texas for real, a war broke out to the United States again, and Mexico lost. And in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico lost half its territory, and this led to Santa Anna going into exile. And triggered new violence between conservatives and liberals. There's the La Reforma in Mexico. Basically, it's when the conservatives, the church, went against the reformers. It was basically conservatives with the church and Western powers went against the reformers. And basically, the reformers, they wanted to basically limit the power of the church, separate church and state, and to strip the church's power. The conservatives, they resisted Reforma, and they were with the church, and they also asked Europeans for help. What happened is the French, they basically got this Australian duke. Duke. He's called Archduke Maximilian as an emperor. The French guy was Napoleon III. That's the leader of France at the time. They got Archduke Maximilian as an emperor, but for a long and this lasted for 4 years. But in the end, the conservatives lost and the liberals won. And then excuse me. And after Juarez died, Juarez was the leader of the Reforma, by the way. So after he died, there's this guy called Porfirio Diaz. He was a hero of the war against the French, and he ruled as a dictator. He said his motto was order and progress. He strengthened the army, local police, and strengthened government, and any opposition to him was crushed. Under his rule, Mexico made a lot of advances in industry, economy, mining, and all of that. And he crushed political opposition. But the rich prospered, but a lot of the normal people, they remained poor, and Indians and mestizos fell into peonage to their employers. And then there was also the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. It is when basically the Americans said that Europeans were not involved, they cannot get involved in the Americas, that only America would be involved in America, and the Europeans, they could not be involved. And the Americans, they started policing in America, the Americas. And this is the Monroe Doctrine. So basically, America became the main imperial power in the Americas, which is just Western Hemisphere. And this cartoon, which is the last cartoon that could be in the test, it is there will be one cartoon in the test actually, and there is 3 that he's giving us. This cartoon, basically, you can see this guy is called Uncle Sam, American guy. He's on a bike, Western Hemisphere here and Eastern Hemisphere. He's basically doing a lot of with the Monroe Doctrine. He's not allowing any of the Europeans get involved with the Western Hemisphere, and he's also influencing the Eastern Hemisphere. So the Europeans, they're getting very angry at him because he is limiting their power. So that's the general idea of this comic. There's also the Panama Canal. It is basically the United States, they wanted to make a canal through Panama because it would allow American warships to move between the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. It'd be better for trade and a lot of that stuff, like shorter shipping times. But Panama, it was part of Gran Colombia at the time, and Gran Colombia did not accept it. They refused to sell the land for the canal. So the United States backed a revolt by the Panamanians against Colombia, and the Panamanians won independence and gave the United States control of the land to build the canal. And eventually they did. But this basically it's the start of the American imperialism in this area. It's the start of American imperialism in general. And a lot of Latin American countries were very angry at this. And they called it Yankee imperialism. Is there anything else? Yeah. And also here, the Dominion. Yeah. So basically, so the Dominion. Like the United States, basically Canada expanded westwards, and as a country, two Canadians, John MacDonald and George H. Here they urged confederation or unification. There was two Canadas at the time, Ontario, Quebec, and they urged the unification of all of these, and also all of the small settlements like Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and all of these. And Britain agreed to the plan because they remembered what happened to the Americans, which they revolted and grew and had independence. So they decided to do it diplomatically because the Canadians also wanted a lot of self-rule. So they agreed to the plan where they made them a dominion, which is a self-governing nation. It had its own parliament. It was basically its own country, but it did not control its foreign policy. And it was like Australia and New Zealand. They had basically the same thing. Also, another important thing, very important, could probably be in the test. You need to know what Métis is. Métis are people of mixed Native American and French Canadian descent in Canada. Very important. Then we have what effects did the Monroe Doctrine and Roosevelt Corollary have in Latin America? Roosevelt Corollary, I think it's basically the same thing as what I said. Anyways, it's basically that it made America the only imperial power that was involved in Latin America and in the Americas in general. And it kicked out any European influence there. And it allowed for a lot of American abuses of power, like the Panama Canal, and later on, many other abuses by America in general. So it had a mixed effect. It's not entirely good or entirely bad because it kicked out the Europeans, but it was also America abusing its power. So that is it. Thank you for watching this for, I suppose. It's probably going to be quite a long video actually, now that I realize it, but I hope this helped you, inshallah. And good luck with your studies. And I'd say that the test is probably going to be easy. It's a عادي الاسماعي. So, good luck, everyone.